Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Neal Kitchen with HydroPeptide. I am the Chief Operating Officer and Chief Geneticist for HydroPeptide, and today I would like to introduce you to the HydroPeptide brand, who we are, and also talk about epigenetics and how it's tied to the aging process within our skin. So we're going to review epigenetics in detail, and hopefully it will help you get a better sense on how this particular area of science influences the aging process within our skin and some of the tools that we can use to overcome that. So let's go ahead and get started. I like to start these types of presentations with this particular statement. We are at our most beautiful when we are at our healthiest. Oftentimes, if I'm in a group or an audience and I make this statement, I get a lot of nods of heads and agreement to this particular statement. And then I typically ask why. And of course, it's easy for us to oftentimes tie our physical health with being at our most beautiful. When we're in peak condition, we've been exercising, we're able, and we say, oh, wow, I feel so healthy. And there is some direct ties to physical health and our beauty. But I also think it's important for us to look at this holistically in the context that it's not just our physical health that's tied to our beauty, it's also tied to a lot of other factors that make us healthy. Our mental health, our emotional health, our spiritual health, all of these tied along with our physical health to really making us feel our most beautiful. And I think this is really important because it ties into a lot of the stuff we're going to talk today about in regards to DNA, epigenetics, and how that actually influences our beauty. Beauty is, of course, should be tied to the health of our bodies. And when we are healthiest, physically, mentally, emotionally, this is tied to how beautiful we can feel and be. All of this, of course, is tied to a very interesting science that we're going to talk about today, which is called epigenetics. At HydroPeptide, our approach is to use the principles of epigenetics, and this allows us to turn on beneficial activities like collagen production and cell renewal. And just as importantly, understanding epigenetics and how they work, it helps us to turn off undesirable reactions like hyperpigmentation and sensitivity caused by inflammation. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about how this works. What is epigenetics and why does it impact these kind of conditions that our skin experiences, whether it's positive or negative interactions? Epigenetics is tied to how our skin reacts, both during our aging process as well as just daily interactions that we have. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how epigenetics is tied to our DNA. Of course, to understand this, we really have to take a closer look at what's happening with our DNA right now. The world is truly discovering its DNA. We're changing in that DNA has gone mainstream, and there's companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com that have made DNA accessible to everyone. Anyone who wants to pay a certain small fee can actually get their DNA sequenced. And of course, our sequencing of our DNA is really cool because it means you have the blueprint of what makes you who you are. That DNA sequence is information that makes you specifically who you are, and it's unique to you. That DNA blueprint is unique to each individual. So what is it that we can actually gain, or what can we actually obtain from getting all of these DNA sequenced? Sequencing of our DNA is a very interesting process, and it allows us to map out the entire genome or sequence of our DNA blueprint. There's a lot of interesting tools that are going to be potentially valuable for both now and in the future when we look at technology that will help us advance the medical field, the skincare industry, and others. When we look at different types of tools that can be used from our DNA sequence, there's population algorithms that can really help us understand the role of inheritance. This means that we can actually look at specific genes or alleles. We can look at disease susceptibility, for example, what are we at risk at? Risk factors are really important for what we can gain from DNA sequences. We can also learn potential response to environmental influences. If we have certain genes, we may respond to the environment differently than with others. Another key factor to gaining all of this information on DNA sequences is we have the vast potential in diagnostics and therapies. Single genes to complex traits can be better understood. This is really important because it allows us to have a better chance of providing the right medicine the first time. Rather than guessing which medicine may actually improve the conditions of an individual, knowing the DNA sequence can also allow us to specifically hone in on what that individual needs to recover from whatever illness they may be experiencing. Of course, there are limitations to this. There's a bottleneck in understanding and analyzing the data. And just as importantly, we're going to talk about how the DNA sequence and mapping our sequence both ties to and is different than what is called epigenetics. And this is really where the question of does environment change the expression patterns of our DNA is so important to the next step in understanding what we can do with our DNA. While knowing our DNA sequence is very valuable, there are other elements such as the environment that influence that. And that's what we're going to talk about today when we talk about epigenetics. But first, let's look at some of these limitations. I actually got my DNA sequence, and here you actually see two companies that I sent my DNA sequence to so that they could analyze my DNA and tell me, what it meant. Xcode Life and LifeGnome are two great companies that are doing this analysis, and they analyze a lot of different areas, disease states, whether or not you're athletic, your potential for being athletic. And primarily what these companies are doing is they're doing a risk factor analysis. When we know our DNA sequence, what we can start assessing is what is the level of risk that we may have to certain dispositions or certain types of conditions. For example, here you see two different interpretations from Xcode Life and LifeGnome on my skin. Both companies, for example, analyzed different genes, and they interpreted that I would have a high risk of wrinkle and collagen degradation. And both of them interpreted it this way. They both said that I had a higher risk based off of my DNA genes, what genes I had, that gave me a higher risk for collagen degradation. Now, of course, this is interesting. This doesn't mean, of course, that I'm going to be all wrinkly, but it does mean that I have a higher risk for it, and so that I need to actually tailor my particular skin regimen to help with mitigating or minimizing the risk of collagen breakdown. But these interpretations are limited by a number of factors. In fact, if you look at the below example, Xcode Life interpreted that I would be less likely to have increased skin glycation, whereas LifeGnome, they analyzed different genes, and their analysis suggested that I would have a higher risk or elevated risk for skin glycation. So while these companies are doing a great job for helping us to understand our risk factors, there's a lot of variables that go into this, and even some of these are interpreted differently based off of what genes they're looking at, what alleles, and how they're interpreting the specific sequence. But now I want to talk a little bit more, not just about how we can understand our risk factors. Do I have a risk for skin glycation or have a risk for collagen breakdown? But we also start looking at how does this risk factor, how is it also influenced by my environment? If I have a healthy environment, does that risk go down? If I have a higher or a high risk environment, does that risk even go up? This has always been a really interesting area of research and study for me in particular, because I happen to be an identical twin. Here's a picture of myself on the left and my identical twin brother, Dale. Now, of course, identical twin means that we actually share the same DNA. And yet gene expression is altered by our environment, meaning that even though we have the exact same DNA sequence, our environment changes or influences how our DNA is being expressed. If you think of our DNA as a blueprint that has all of the information we need, just like a blueprint is being read by an architect to build a building, he can change or modify those instructions based off of what he needs or what he thinks he needs to change as he's building that. The same thing actually happens with us as human beings. We have a DNA map that shows us who we are, and that DNA map is unique to us. But even in identical twins, how that map is being read, how it's being interpreted, how the genes are being expressed influences different things. Dale and I, of course, share a lot of identity. In fact, we actually went on to 23andMe and had both of our sequences mapped and showed that we are sharing 100% of our DNA. In other words, our DNA is absolutely identical. So the differences you see in our appearance, for example, is not due to our DNA map, that sequence name. What causes those differences is something that we call epigenetics, where epigenetics influences how our DNA is being expressed. For example, my twin brother Dale has always been a few inches taller than me. This is, of course, due not to our DNA sequence, but how that DNA sequence is expressed. When we were in my mother's womb, for example, he had the majority of nutrients from the placenta. I sometimes say that he was a placenta hog and give him a hard time about that. But what it meant is during that critical growth period in our mother's womb, he had nutrients that I didn't. And because of that, it changed the expression patterns of our DNA. And when we were born, he was about a couple pounds heavier than I was. And it actually influenced our growth pattern, where he was always taller than me, even when we were little. And of course, now as we grow, we have similar lifestyles, but as we do different things, we can see different changes in how we age, for example. And all of that's tied to this science called epigenetics, which helps us to understand how our DNA is being expressed. When I first started researching this in early 2000, there were very little publications on epigenetics, but as you can see from this graph, the publications on epigenetics has grown exponentially. And even in mainstream media, we now see articles about what is epigenetics, how does it work, and how is it tied to aging, and in particular to the aging of our skin. And so we're going to look more closely on what is epigenetics, how it works, and of course then tie it to the aging process within our skin. And then look at some of the ways that we can actually use genetics to solve some of the challenges that we have in the aging process. So when we look at molecular epigenetics, what we're looking at is a science or discipline that helps define how our body expresses its DNA. When we look at the cell, every cell in our body is made up of protein and a DNA map that's a complete set of instructions. On this DNA map or blueprint, we have information or even individual instruction that we call a gene. A gene shows the recipe or instructions to making the essential proteins that our body and cells need to function properly. For example, if our body needs more collagen, we have our DNA, we tell our DNA to express the specific gene that produces more collagen protein. That expression is very critical for our body's response. It helps us to know when to turn on genes, and just as importantly, when to turn off genes. And so through this epigenetic process, we modify our DNA in a way that allows us to express the right gene at the right time. I sometimes like to use the analogy of a master piano. A piano is a great way of showing how epigenetics works and why it matters. If you think of our DNA as an immense piano keyboard and our genes as keys, each key symbolizes a segment of DNA responsible for a particular note or trait. And all the keys combined make us who we are. So when we think of the processes, they did when and how each key can be changing and being played. Looking at this piano a little more closely at the level, what this means is that we have the ability to note, play a key. This is gene activation or turning a gene on. And we also have instructions that tell us not to play a certain note or play a certain key. We call this gene silencing. Gene activation, where we modify the blueprint so that we can turn on a particular instruction to turn on a gene, helps us to produce certain proteins at the right time to allow it to work properly. We also have a very important structure that also allows us to turn off specific genes. This is an important whole differentiation process of the body. you think, for example, of how complex the human body is, we have different cells within our body. We have cells that make up our eyes, our liver, our skin. All of these cells share the same, and you've been able to change, modify how the blueprint is being read so that specific genes are turned on, specific genes are turned off. This allows us to have unique cells within our body and make us this complex organism of all different types of cells that have the same DNA blueprint but express it differently. Epigenetics also helps us understand how the different notes are being played as we age. Our DNA blueprint doesn't change as we age. What changes is how it's being expressed. So like a piano masterpiece, our bodies need to determine how to play each note together, the strength of expression, and how long to hold each note. And this whole epigenetic process really influences who we are. This is actually quite fascinating when you consider it at the aging process. When we start looking at aging at the cellular level, what we're actually looking at is whether or not our DNA blueprint is in its optimal state. In our youthful state, we call this our normal chromatin state. That means that the DNA blueprint is being structured in such a way that it is expressed correctly. All of the right genes are turned off, and just as importantly, the ones that we need to have turned off are turned off. As we age, oftentimes, aging process, we think about what we visibly see in an aging process, but what we're really seeing is at the cellular level, changes occurring that cause the normal chromatin state to go to an abnormal chromatin state. This, of course, can be mutations to the blueprint. We call those DNA mutations. But more frequently, what we're seeing is that the aging process is actually due to altered patterns of the DNA blueprint structure. So it's not just changes in the DNA sequence, it's changes in the DNA structure that can lead to slower cellular processes and an aging cellular state. I think this is actually a really important step for us to start considering that aging is really at the cellular level. Oftentimes, when we look, for example, at aging skin, we oftentimes think about what we visibly see. Aging skin is oftentimes associated with characteristics that we visibly see, such as fine lines and wrinkles, dull and lackluster skin, or age spots, or pigmentation. All of these things occur and we visibly see them, but it's important for us to take a step back and say, okay, it's not what we're visibly seeing that is the only thing that matters. What actually matters is what's happening at the cellular level. Aging skin cells are what lead to all of those visible cues that we see in the aging process, whether they're fine lines and wrinkles or some other damage on the surface of the skin. What we're actually seeing is different changes in the expression pattern, or in other words, a damaged epigenetic state where the expression patterns have changed that lead to these visible cues that we see as aging. A lot of times we see that in different types of cell challenges. Aging skin cells often have inflammation, sensitivity, senescent cells that will lead to problems within our skin. For example, senescent cells mean that cells have gone dormant. They're no longer producing or proliferating. They're no longer dividing, and they're no longer producing the proteins that are needed. For example, if you see a senescent fibroblast, that fibroblast is no longer producing the protein that is needed to structure the skin. If a fibroblast isn't producing collagen, then our production of collagen goes down. And so if we have a reduction in collagen, this leads to fine lines and wrinkles that we see on the surface of the skin. Of course, this aging process can occur chronologically, but it's oftentimes accelerated through photoaging and premature aging. And one of the interesting things that I've observed as we've analyzed how epigenetics works within the skin is that aging at the cellular level is not tied to our chronological age. In other words, compromised cellular health is something that we can experience both young and old. And in the reverse aspect of that, we can actually have a healthy cellular state both young and old. This is why you can have a client, patient, or even see it within your own skin, you beautiful, flawless in your 50s and 60s. And you can also have clients that come in their 20s, skin is compromised, their skin is damaged, and they do not have healthy looking skin. So even though they have that young logical in their 20s, they don't necessarily have that healthy cellular state that allows them to have healthy skin. So I think this is a really important separation, that our chronological age is not tied to the age of our cells. And so I think it's a really important transition that we're making within the skincare industry, is not looking at how old we are chronologically, but looking at how healthy is our skin. If we have healthy cellular state, then our skin can actually look youthful and have that ageless appearance even as we age. Let's illustrate this example of how this works and how this aging occurs through this particular diagram. Aging skin at the cell level is really a principle of two important steps that our body naturally uses. We have what we call our ideal or happy state. This is when our epigenetic state is in its best or optimized state. It's where DNA expression is running perfectly. We have the right genes turned on, the ones that need to be turned off are turned off. This optimal state or happy state is when the music is playing perfectly. We don't have a sour note. Of course, the problem that we have is that we do live in an environment where that can't always happen. We have an environment that oftentimes has negative influences on our skin. I oftentimes find it really interesting to ask a group or an audience of fans that inflammation is bad. Of course, I'll get quite a few people that will raise their hand, and then how many do you think inflammation is good? And I'll get a few brave people that raise their hands. And then I say, okay, well, how many do you think inflammation can be both good and bad? And I'll get a lot of people that will raise their hands. And of course, the answer is that inflammation is both good and bad, depending on how it's used. Let me illustrate this through a couple of examples. Inflammation is a response that our body uses to repair any particular type of damage that has happened. When damage occurs, we have different genes that are turned on or triggered to an altered expression state to repair the damage. This is really important because that triggering to help what we call our wound response, to help fix something, allows our body to repair any damage so that it can get back to this happy state. So while we would love to always be in this happy state, it's really important that we have this temporary state or inflammation response that allows us to fix and repair the damage that has been done so that the body can get returned back to its optimal or happy state. It's a shuttle between this happy state and temporary state all the time because we live in an environment that requires that. Our body has actually been adapted to be able to respond to physical damage and to repair itself quite robustly. That wound response is one we see in another example. I oftentimes give the example that if I was walking through my family late at night and it was dark, bumped my shin really hard against the coffee table, I would have an immediate pain response that was part of that inflammation response. And it's a fascinating response where that inflammation causes immediate sensitivity to that area. It's tender, my shin is in pain. I have all those pain cues to allow my body to know I did something wrong and it needs to be repaired. And of course, I'll have bruising, that tenderness is there, and that's this temporary state of wound response that's helped fix my shin. And of course, the good news is after a few days, my shin is back to normal. It's no longer tender, and that bruise finally disappears, and it goes back to this happy state. Now, of course, the challenge we have is that while this inflammation response is very important because it allows us to repair and fix things, one of the challenges that we find is that if we don't allow that temporary state to repair, then it can't get back to this happy state. In other words, if I've been letting my shin, for example, heal, the very next night, I walked through the family room and kicked my shin in the exact same spot on that coffee table again. I'm going to immediately a second wound response, an additional wound response. But what happens if that night I hit it again, and the fourth night, and the fifth night, over and over and over, I repeatedly hit the area where my shin has been bruised? What then happens is the DNA changes its expression patterns. It goes to this constant inflammation, forcing a change in the expression pattern. We go to a damaged state. We can see this in examples. For example, I used construction. I did a lot of shoveling and digging trenches. And when I first started, my tender hands would form blisters because of all of the digging. But as I worked and worked and worked through the summer, I damaged those blisters pattern was altered, and I started forming what were called calluses. Those blisters were so that my skin became thicker in that particular area. That thickening of the skin to form the calluses protected my skin from the constant damage I was applying to it by doing all of that construction work. But that damaged state also meant I altered the appearance of my skin in that particular area on my hands because of that protective state. Of course, we can see this as well in people who expose the sun year after year after year. Their skin begins to look almost leathery because of that thickening to try to protect the skin. It's an altered or damaged state. Now, of course, as I no longer do construction work, I found that my calluses are no longer present. They've been significantly reduced, and I've been able to bring my skin back to a happy state. And so this is a really important principle because it allows us to actually say, okay, even if I go into this damaged state, can I get myself back to an optimal happy state? And of course, the answer is absolutely yes. But the key is finding tools that allow us to stay in this happy state as long as possible and as frequently as possible, and allowing this temporary state to occur efficiently and effectively, but also allow it to bounce back to this happy state without having that constant damage that leads to an altered DNA state. So as we look at how to do this, at HydroPeptide, we've really tried to take the principles in epigenetics and how aging is occurring at the cellular level to start producing products that really maximize the approach that we can take to skincare. At HydroPeptide, we use these three key principles to help us focus on developing the right types of products and protocols and skincare routines that allow us to keep our skin in that optimal state. We use the principles of epigenetics to be geneticist developed, and this helps our skin act and look younger. And of course, we do this through clinical results, delivering clinically tested ingredients with botanicals in a way that they can actually provide the right signals to the skin to change the expression patterns in a positive way to allow our skin to produce protein like collagen in a meaningful way. And of course, I think another important part of this is that we do this through luxury experiences. We believe every formula should provide an elevated sensorial experience because this is actually also tied to the epigenetic process. As I said at the beginning, our health and beauty are tied together, and that they influence how our DNA is being expressed. That is also true to the experience that we have within our skincare. Many times I talk influence of epigenetics within all of the different things experience. This is not just tied to skincare products, but it's also tied to the experiences we share. Within a spa treatment, for example, the expression patterns change based off of the sensorial experience you are having. Those expression patterns that are influenced by a massage, a technique, can influence in how our DNA changes pattern. And so it's really important to look at all three of these principles as a way of elevating the improvements within our skin and ultimately looking at the health of our skin. We really like to say that we focus on a cellular health approach as a brand. We focus on using or creating solutions that benefit the long-term health of our skin and move us towards genuine personalization, that we can really look at focusing on what does my DNA need, not just because of what my DNA says, but also because of how is my DNA being expressed in a given moment. And of course, that expression can change constantly. And so it's really important to understand how our DNA is expressing itself both morning and night and through the different environments that we have, and changing our skincare regimen to allow us to combat the different challenges that we might need to keep our skin in that optimized cellular health approach or cellular state. And this is a really important concept to what we need to do within our skincare routines, is looking for those long-term health solutions. I oftentimes challenge the industry that a lot of the techniques that we use are based on treating the symptoms and not the problem. And I think it's really important for us to actually look at an approach that allows us to really look at the long-term health of our skin. Epigenetics allows us to do that. We can use the principles of epigenetics to develop the right types of products and regimens to optimize our skin in a meaningful way. We use ingredients and treatments that can positively impact the expression patterns in our skin. We create strategies, facial treatments, for example, treat the problem, not just the symptom. It's one thing to say, okay, lines and wrinkles, let's get rid of those, but it's another thing to say, how did those fine lines and wrinkles develop? Can we develop strategies that help us to reverse the state of your cells so that those fine lines and wrinkles can disappear? And of course, another key factor is that we want to optimize our skincare to correct, protect, and enhance our skin. We want to correct any or damaged states that exist within our skin, but we also want to protect that optimal and optimize that or enhance that optimal state. I think it's important to note that just because you're young doesn't mean you have perfect, flawless skin. And that's part of the challenge here, is that we're looking at not protect our youthful state in our skin, but we're also saying how can we enhance or optimize that happy state with skin, because we can do that with skin or older skin. And of course, we're continuing to look at innovation, leveraging patented technology to advance our skin science research and to use these epigenetic tools in a meaningful way. So hopefully, as you go into more of our research on specific products, you'll be able to see how we're applying these principles of epigenetics in skincare. But we wanted to leave this particular part of learning about the brand and how we use epigenetics to develop unique formulation protocols that transform you and your client's skin in a meaningful way. Hopefully you have found this presentation beneficial and learning a little bit about how epigenetics, how the principles of epigenetics within skincare, and how we can leverage those to really develop the right kind of solutions to help our skin act younger and to be able to express itself in the right way. So with that, I'll say thank you for listening to this presentation, and there will be other presentations like this one that go into more specific technologies, more specific formulations, and how they at an epigenetic level. Again, thank you for participating. Bye.